For 15 years, Thomas Mercer had lived peacefully on his 5-acre property at the edge of Willowbrook Estates. His land sat just outside the upscale suburban development's boundaries, featuring a natural creek that meandered from the mountains through his property and continued through the edge of the housing development. Thomas had purchased the land when it was still surrounded by farmland and woods, long before developers had transformed the adjacent acreage into an exclusive gated community with manicured lawns and identical mailboxes. The creek had been the primary reason Thomas bought the property in the first place. After 30 years of teaching high school biology in the city, he dreamed of retiring somewhere with a touch of wilderness. The moment he'd seen the clear water tumbling over smooth stones, he knew he'd found home. Within the first year of ownership, Thomas had built a small wooden bridge spanning the narrowest part of the creek and created a tranquil garden area where he spent many evenings listening to the gentle babble of flowing water. Over the years, Thomas had developed an intimate relationship with the waterway. He could predict which wildflowers would bloom along its banks each month and had documented 27 bird species that regularly visited to drink or hunt for insects. In spring, he watched families of ducks raise their young in the reedy areas, and in autumn, he observed the subtle changes in the maple and oak leaves reflected in the water's surface before they felt to become part of the natural cycle. The creek was more than just aesthetically pleasing. It was vital to the local ecosystem and served as natural drainage for the entire area, especially during the heavy spring rains. Thomas had meticulously maintained the waterway, removing fallen branches and plastic debris carried from upstream, ensuring its natural flow remained unimpeded. Twice a year, he organized small volunteer cleanups that attracted a few environmental science students from the community college where he occasionally guest lectured. Most residents of Willowbrook Estates benefited from Thomas's quiet stewardship, though few were aware of his efforts. The development's marketing materials even featured photographs of pristine natural areas that were, in fact, images of Thomas's carefully tended creek beds. Some of the more environmentally conscious homeowners would occasionally stop by to thank him or bring homemade preserves during the holidays, but for the most part, the relationship between Thomas and the development had been one of distant mutual respect. All that changed when Patricia Harrington was elected as the new Willowbrook Estates HOA president. A former corporate executive who had recently relocated from the city, Patricia had campaigned on a platform of modernization and enhancement. Fresh from her victory and eager to make her mark, she began implementing new initiatives to enhance and protect property values in the exclusive community. Her first month in office had seen the installation of a more imposing entrance gate, stricter enforcement of lawn maintenance bylaws, and a controversial ban on certain visually disruptive holiday decorations. Thomas had heard rumors about the new HOA leadership from his few friends in the development, but he paid little attention to such matters. His property existed outside their jurisdiction, and he had always maintained a live and let live philosophy. Little did he know that Patricia's vision for Willowbrook's enhanced aesthetic standards would soon bring her to his doorstep with plans that would threaten the delicate balance he had maintained for 15 peaceful years. Patricia wasted no time scheduling a meeting with Thomas. She arrived at his modest home one Saturday morning in early May, accompanied by 2 board members, Jeffrey Winters, a retired attorney, and Diane Collins, a real estate agent, without prior notice. Thomas had been in the garden planting native wildflowers along the creek bank when the sound of tires on gravel announced visitors. Patricia stepped out of her white Lexus SUV, designer heels sinking slightly into the soft path as she approached. The contrast between her immaculate business attire and Thomas's dirt-stained garden clothes was immediately apparent. Standing on his porch in her navy blue suit, she extended a manicured hand that Thomas awkwardly shook after hastily wiping his palms on his jeans. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Patricia Harrington, the new president of Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association," she announced with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "These are my colleagues on the board. We apologize for dropping by unannounced, but we have an important matter to discuss regarding the shared boundary between your property and our community." Thomas offered them iced tea, which Jeffrey and Diane accepted while Patricia declined. They sat on Thomas's hand-built deck overlooking the creek, the sound of flowing water providing a peaceful backdrop to what would quickly become a tense conversation. "Mr. Mercer," Patricia said, peering at him over her designer glasses, "the creek presents certain liabilities for our development. We've had complaints about mosquitoes, concerns about children's safety, and several residents have mentioned unpleasant odors during the summer months. The board has unanimously decided it's time to improve this situation." Thomas set down his glass, feeling a knot forming in his stomach. The creek has been here for generations. It's home to countless species and serves as critical drainage for the entire watershed. "What exactly are you proposing?" Patricia nodded to Diane, who pulled out a tablet and showed Thomas renderings of a landscaped area where the creek currently flowed into the development. The natural stream was replaced with a manicured stone border around a small decorative pond, with no visible flowing water beyond it. We'll be removing the unsightly vegetation, installing proper filtration, and creating a controlled water feature that enhances rather than detracts from our properties, Patricia explained, her tone suggesting she was offering him a gift rather than announcing a disruption. Thomas leaned forward, trying to keep his voice even. That looks like you're planning to redirect the creek underground. Water needs to flow naturally. It's been flowing this way for decades, long before Willowbrook was built. Interfering with it could cause serious problems with erosion, wildlife habitats, even flooding during heavy rains. We appreciate your environmental concerns, Diane interjected smoothly, but we've consulted with experts from Greenfield Development Corporation. They've assured us this design is state-of-the-art and environmentally responsible. Thomas recognized the company name, the same developers who had clear-cut the forest to build Willowbrook Estates 10 years ago. Have you consulted with independent hydrologists or the County Water Management Board? They might have different perspectives. Patricia's smile tightened, creating small creases at the corners of her mouth. We appreciate your concern, Mr. Mercer, but this decision has already been finalized. We'll be installing a culvert system where the creek enters our property line and redirecting the water underground through the development. The visible portion on your land is, of course, your business. Jeffrey, who had remained silent until now, added in a practiced legal tone, the HOA bylaws give us complete authority over aesthetic and safety improvements within our boundaries. We're merely informing you as a courtesy. Before leaving, Patricia handed Thomas a glossy folder containing detailed plans that had already been approved by the HOA board and stamped by the county building department. A yellow sticky note indicated construction would begin the following week. As they walked back to their cars, Thomas stood holding the folder, watching the creek water flow obliviously toward a fate that had already been decided without its consent or his. True to her word, construction crews arrived the following Monday. Thomas awoke to the rumble of heavy equipment and stepped onto his porch to witness a procession of trucks, excavators, and workers in bright yellow vests filing onto the boundary where his property met Willowbrook Estates. From the vantage point of his garden, Thomas watched helplessly as mechanical jaws tore into the soft earth around the creek, ripping out native plants and disrupting decades of natural growth. The foreman, a weathered man named Carl, approached Thomas' property line when he noticed him watching. "Morning," he called out with an apologetic grimace. "You must be the neighbor. Sorry about the noise. We should be done with the heavy work in about a week." Thomas walked over to speak with him. "Do you understand what this might do to the watershed? That culvert system looks significantly narrower than the creek's natural width." Carl shrugged, lowering his voice. "Between you and me, I mentioned the same thing to the project manager. But the plans were already approved, and they're cutting costs wherever they can. I'm just following the blueprints." He glanced back at his crew. "Listen, I've got to get back. Just maybe consider some flood mitigation on your side. These developers, they can always think about downstream effects." For the next 2 weeks, Thomas documented the construction process with his camera. The workers installed large concrete culverts, effectively channeling the creek underground as it entered Willowbrook Estates. Where the flowing water had once created a natural boundary filled with cattails, willows, and the occasional visiting heron, now stood a manicured slope leading to a small decorative pool with a recirculating fountain. A discreet grate at the bottom allowed the actual creek water to disappear underground. By early June, the first problems emerged. The culvert system was clearly undersized for the creek's normal flow, creating a bottleneck effect. Water began backing up on Thomas' property, turning parts of his once beautiful garden into a muddy swamp. The native irises he planted years ago were submerged, their purple blooms drooping beneath the rising water. During a particularly heavy late spring rainstorm, Thomas stayed up all night, watching anxiously as the water rose to alarming levels, threatening the foundation of his modest home. He spent hours in the downpour digging emergency trenches to divert water away from his house, his clothes soaked through and his aging back screaming in protest. The next morning, Thomas methodically documented the flooding with photographs. Watermarks on trees showing the unprecedented levels, drowned gardens, and the stark contrast between his flooded land and the dry, manicured entrance to Willowbrook Estates. He hired Martin Oakes, an environmental engineer recommended by a former colleague, who visited to assess the situation. After taking measurements and reviewing historical rainfall data, Martin confirmed Thomas's fears. The HOA's modifications have severely restricted the creek's natural flow capacity, he explained, pointing to his calculations. This culvert can handle maybe 60% of what would come through during normal spring rains and far less during a significant storm event. It's just going to get worse. Armed with Martin's official report, Thomas reached out to Patricia via email, attaching photographs, data, and the engineer's findings. Her response came 3 days later, brief and dismissive. "Our residents are thrilled with the improvement," she wrote. "The The unsightly creek is gone, the mosquito problem is resolved, and our property values are already reflecting the positive change. Your drainage issues are unfortunate but unrelated to our project. Perhaps you should consider professional landscaping to address the standing water on your property. Frustrated, Thomas contacted the county water management department, where a sympathetic official named Deborah Chen reviewed his documentation with a frown. They obtained permits through an expedited process, she admitted. The HOA president knows people on the board. There was minimal environmental review because they classified it as an aesthetic improvement rather than a watershed modification. When Thomas asked about challenging the permits, Deborah sighed. You could file an appeal, but honestly, these legal challenges often take years and cost tens of thousands in attorney fees. Most homeowners just can't afford to fight it. She hesitated before adding, I wish I could be more helpful. I've seen this pattern before, and it rarely ends well for the small property owner. Frustrated but determined, Thomas refused to accept defeat. In late June, he began spending his evenings at the county records office and the local university library, researching water rights law and local watershed regulations. The librarian, Eleanor Phelps, had been a student of his 20 years ago and offered to help with his research. Look at these land registry documents, Eleanor said one afternoon, spreading yellowed papers across the reading room table. Your property was originally part of the Caldwell Farm, which dates back to 1887. That's significant because water rights established before 1900 have special status under state law. Thomas discovered that his property included what was legally classified as a senior water right that predated the development by decades. More importantly, when examining his original property deed at the county clerk's office, he found specific language about an easement for the natural watercourse that ran through the parcel. The natural flow of water shall remain unimpeded through the described property in perpetuity, read the clause included when the original farm was subdivided in the 1970s. Energized by this discovery, Thomas contacted Sarah Rosenthal, a lawyer specializing in environmental and property law, who had once given a guest lecture at his school. After reviewing the documents during a consultation in her modest office filled with potted ferns and legal texts, Sarah confirmed Thomas had a strong case. The combination of senior water rights and the specific easement language is compelling, she said, removing her reading glasses. But I need to be completely honest with you. Litigation against an HOA with their resources could take years and cost upwards of $50,000. She tapped his deed with her pen. That's money I'm guessing you don't have as a retired school teacher. Thomas's face fell as he calculated his limited savings, much of which had already gone to Martin's engineering assessment and emergency landscaping to protect his home. Sarah, noticing his expression, leaned forward. There might be another approach, she suggested, pulling out a thick binder of county regulations. She flipped to a highlighted section of the county water management code. Your water right includes the right to reasonable use and management of the water that flows through your property, provided you don't cause harm to downstream users. What exactly does that mean in practice? Thomas asked. It means you have considerable latitude in how you manage the water before it leaves your property, Sarah explained. The law recognizes that upstream users need to protect their own interests as long as they're not deliberately causing harm downstream. This gave Thomas an idea. He thanked Sarah and paid her consultation fee, promising to stay in touch about his progress. Over the next several weeks, Thomas immersed himself in research. He spent days studying topographical maps of the area at the county planning office, noting how the water flowed throughout the watershed. He reconnected with Martin, the environmental engineer, discussing various hydraulic systems that could help manage the water flow on his property. You could install a retention system, Martin suggested during a weekend visit, sketching plans at Thomas's kitchen table. It would be completely legal as an agricultural water management system, especially if you register it for wildlife conservation purposes. Thomas also began attending Willowbrook Estate's HOA meetings as a non-member observer, sitting quietly in the back of their clubhouse meeting room. Patricia acknowledged his presence with cool nods but never addressed him directly. Thomas carefully noted the rising complaints from residents about water pressure issues in the development since the creek had been diverted. My sprinkler system barely functions anymore, complained one resident during the July meeting. The landscaping service says there's not enough pressure in our irrigation system. And what about the standing water near the tennis courts after that last rain? Added another homeowner. My kids say it smells terrible. Patricia deflected these concerns, blaming the municipal water system and promising to have the landscape company address any issues. Thomas took detailed notes, beginning to see how the pieces might fit together in a way that could restore balance without requiring a lengthy court battle. 3 months after the culvert installation in mid-August, Thomas was ready to implement his plan. He hired Blue Ridge Excavators, a local company run by Carl's brother-in-law, the same foreman who had warned him during the initial construction. The crew arrived on a Monday morning to create what the permit application described as a seasonal wetland habitat and agricultural water management system on the lowest corner of his property. "We're digging a retention pond here," Thomas explained to his nearest neighbor, Mrs. Abernathy, who watched curiously over the fence as the excavator carved a graceful crescent-shaped depression. "It'll help with the flooding and create a habitat for native species." What Thomas didn't mention was the sophisticated water management system being installed alongside the pond. Working from Martin's detailed specifications, the excavators positioned controllable outflow pipes leading toward the culvert entrance. The system featured adjustable gates that would allow Thomas to regulate water flow with precision. "This setup is completely above board," Martin assured him as they inspected the work. "It's designed for normal conditions where water flows as usual. But during heavy rains, you can prevent your property from flooding by controlling how much water enters their underside's culvert." He tapped the main control valve. "Everything stays on your side of the property line, which keeps you legally protected." The project cost Thomas nearly all of his remaining savings, but as he watched the finished pond begin to fill naturally from groundwater in the creek, he felt a sense of cautious optimism. Native water plants were installed along the edges, and within days, a family of ducks had discovered the new habitat. Thomas meticulously documented the system with photographs and detailed notes on water flow rates, creating a log that would prove valuable later. The system operated unobtrusively through the remainder of August, with most of the water flowing normally through to the culvert. Few in Willowbrook Estates even noticed the change. Thomas carefully monitored weather forecasts, waiting for an opportunity to test the system's effectiveness. That opportunity came in early September when the remnants of a coastal hurricane brought 3 days of steady rainfall to the region. As the water level rose, Thomas began adjusting his system to protect his property, allowing only the amount of water through that the culvert could handle without backing up onto his land. The rest accumulated in his retention pond, designed to handle the overflow. From his covered porch, Thomas watched the rain falling in sheets across his property. The water level in the pond rose steadily but remained within its design capacity. His gardens, which had been swamped during previous rains, remained safely above the water line. For the first time since the HOA's construction, Thomas felt in control of his situation. In Willowbrook Estates, however, residents began noticing problems by the second day of rain. With the creek's natural flow interrupted and Thomas's system regulating the input, the development's elaborate landscape irrigation system, which had been secretly tapping into the creek's water for years without proper permits, began failing dramatically. Sprinklers throughout the common areas sputtered and died, leaving expensive landscaping vulnerable. More significantly, the development's stormwater management system, which had been designed with the assumption of the creek's continuous flow, became overwhelmed during the heavy rains. Streets in the lower section of the development, particularly near Patricia's proudly landscaped cul-de-sac, experienced minor flooding for the first time in the neighborhood's history. Emergency pumps were brought in at considerable expense. But without the creek's natural capacity to move water away from the development, it struggled to keep up with the deluge. The decorative fountain at the entrance, Patricia's prize aesthetic improvement, now sat in the middle of a growing pond that extended well beyond its design boundaries. Thomas received 3 voicemails from Patricia during the rain event, each progressively less composed. He returned none of them, instead documenting the functioning of his system with meticulous readings and photographs. When Sarah, his attorney, called to check on him, he shared the data showing that his system was operating exactly as designed, protecting his property while allowing the maximum safe amount of water through to the development's culvert. "Remember," Sarah cautioned, "the key legal principle is that you're managing the water to prevent harm to your property, not to deliberately cause problems downstream. Keep documenting everything." By the time the rain stopped, Thomas had a comprehensive record of his system's performance, and Willowbrook Estates had a serious water management problem that could no longer be ignored. The aftermath of the September storm brought a crisis to Willowbrook Estates. The HOA emergency fund was rapidly depleted by water damage repairs, and their insurance company was raising difficult questions about the modified creek and unpermitted water usage. Property values, which Patricia had promised would rise with her aesthetic improvements, began showing signs of decline after several real estate listings mentioned seasonal drainage concerns. It took 3 flooded HOA meetings, each more contentious than the last, before Patricia and the board finally approached Thomas for a discussion. Diane Collins, the real estate agent on the board who was watching her commissions dwindle, had been particularly vocal about finding a solution. This time, they met on more equal terms at Greenleaf Coffee Shop in the nearby town center, neutral ground for all parties. Patricia arrived first for typically perfect appearance, showing subtle signs of strain, slightly smudged mascara, and an uncharacteristic wrinkle in her silk blouse. She lost a unanimous vote of confidence the previous evening, but retained her position only because no one else wanted to inherit the water crisis. "Mr. Mercer," she began when Thomas settled into the booth across from her, board members flanking her sides. "Our engineers say there's a problem with water flow that's affecting our development." Her tone was notably less commanding than during their first meeting. They believe it might be related to changes in the water possibly on your property. Thomas sipped his coffee calmly, then placed a folder on the table, a mirror image of the one she had handed in months ago, only his contained documentation of the flooding on his property, Martin's engineering reports, and the water rights paperwork his attorney had prepared. "I'm simply exercising my right to manage water on my property," he explained, his voice steady and without malice. "Just as you exercise your right to modify the creek on yours." Jeffrey Winters, the attorney who had once smugly quoted HOA bylaws, now leafed through Thomas's documentation with a furrowed brow. "This is quite thoroughly researched," he admitted reluctantly. "Have you had legal counsel review this?" "Sarah Rosenthal is representing me," Thomas replied, mentioning a name that caused Jeffrey to wince slightly. They had opposed each other in court before. After several tense meetings spanning 2 weeks, involving attorneys from both sides and county water management officials, a compromise began to emerge. The turning point came when Martin gave a presentation to the HOA board using time-lapse modeling to show how the water would continue to deteriorate unless natural flow was restored. "Your culvert system is fundamentally inadequate," he concluded, showing slides of similar developments that have faced costly lawsuits after flooding damaged homeowners' properties. "It's not a question of if major damage will occur, but when." A solution drafted by a committee that included Thomas, Patricia, and experts from both sides was comprehensive. The HOA would fund the replacement of their inadequate culvert system with a properly sized natural stream restoration project designed by environmental engineers to handle even heavy water flows. Thomas would modify his retention system to work in harmony with the restored creek, maintaining its function as a wildlife habitat while relinquishing some of his control over the water flow. The project would cost the HOA considerably more than the original culvert installation, but significantly less than potential litigation or property damage. Patricia presented it to residents as a forward-thinking environmental initiative, rather than an admission of error, allowing her to save face while supporting the necessary changes. 6 months later, on a warm spring day, Thomas stood on his wooden bridge watching the creek once again flow naturally through his property and into the development. The HOA had added educational signage about the importance of natural waterways, turning what Patricia had once called an unsightly natural area into an environmental feature that actually increased property values. Realtors were now advertising waterfront lots at premium prices along the restored creek path. Thomas' garden had slowly recovered, the native plants returning with renewed vigor. He found himself hosting occasional tours for Willowbrook residents interested in natural landscaping, including several who were converting portions of their manicured lawns to rain gardens and native habitat. At the next HOA election, Patricia was replaced by Diane Collins, who had championed the creek restoration after recognizing its positive impact on property values. The new president's first official act was to establish an environmental committee to prevent similar